Hi everyone, welcome to International Angel Shark Day. My name is Nick Dulvy and I'm the co-chair along with Colin Simpendorfer and Deputy Chair Sonia Fordham of the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Shark Specialist Group. And today I'm going to talk to you about our approach to saving sharks and rays. But before I get into it, I just want to talk about the Shark Specialist Group itself. It's a remarkable organization of 180 volunteer scientists, policymakers, and conservationists based in 12 regions throughout the world. And our vision really is for a world where sharks, rays, and chimeras are valued and used sustainably. Our mission is to secure the conservation, management, and where necessary, the recovery of the world's sharks, rays, and chimeras by mobilizing global, technical, and scientific expertise. The shorthand way of saying it is we provide the knowledge that enables action. Now, IUCN Species Survival Commission Network has a three-pronged approach or a cycle to conservation. First we assess, then we plan, then we act. Only by doing this do we avoid conservation being a whole series of random acts of kindness. For the first 20 years of the life of the Shark Specialist Group, time was spent undertaking red list assessment of all of the species. And this first Herculean effort was summarized in this paper, Extinction, Risk and Conservation of the World's Sharks and Rays. And so for the first time, we really had a handle on how threatened is a group of exploited fishes in the ocean. And the short story is that we think that about a quarter of species are threatened with an elevated risk of extinction. And some species are facing a higher level of risk than others. And it turns out that there are 68 species that were classified as endangered or critically endangered. And what surprised many is that the bulk of these most threatened species were flat sharks. Indeed, there were 50 of them. We've heard a lot over the last decade about the impact of shark finning and the global fin trade on sharks and rays. The reality is that many of these flat sharks don't have fins of any significance, and many are the collateral damage of trawl fisheries, gillnet fisheries, and long lines in shallow coastal, tropical, and temperate waters. And many of these fisheries are effectively unmanaged with respect to this collateral damage or bycatch of flat sharks and rays. And this group includes mainly rays and skates, but here we can see Squatinus squatina, the iconic angel shark, an amazing sit and wait predator. And there are 22 species of these fantastic sharks found mainly in the temperate waters of the world's oceans. And if you want to keep track of what's happening with flat sharks, follow along on these hashtags. But we could take a really data-driven approach to prioritize groups of species for conservation. And when we looked at various lineages and figured out what proportion of species were threatened, we found two groups that really stood out as deserving our highest priority for the subsequent decade: sawfishes and angel sharks. And indeed, we find that 5 out of these 7 groups are flat sharks. These priorities were quickly recognized by the Global Shark and Ray Initiative, and we can see that we have the angel shark front and center on top of the global priority for conserving sharks and rays, their decade-long strategy ending in 2025. This priority was uptaken by the Shark Conservation Fund. So the challenge now is, how do we set about conserving wide-ranging exploited marine species? Well, the template that IUCN Species Survival Commission offers is a summary really of decades of developing action plans. And this is all codified in a handbook of strategic conservation planning. But everything in that handbook largely comes from everything we've learned about conservation, which effectively is everything we've learned about conserving terrestrial organisms found only on land. And when we look through the action plans and strategies, we find they're either single species like the bonobo, a species of chimpanzee, or there are a handful of species found in one place, for example, mountain sheep and goats in Tunisia, or even a single species in 2 countries, Raffles banded langur, found in Malaysia and Singapore. So to a first approximation, most of terrestrial conservation has been local and site-based. You know, we love what we see around us, and it motivates us to do local conservation in our province, our town, our country. And fortunately, there's been enough of these activities that we've managed to span across a large fraction of the range of many terrestrial species and make a global difference to the status of these species. The problem comes with looking through these data is that in contrast to what happens on land, the pattern of extinction risk is fundamentally different. Basically, wide-ranging sharks and rays are falling through the cracks of conservation, and the cracks really occur between countries. Saving a shark in one country doesn't mean that legislation and activity will happen in many of the other countries that the shark is found. And this is captured by this graph. Here we have on the x-axis the geographic range of sharks and rays, not measured in kilometers or nautical miles, but instead measured in terms of the number of legal jurisdictions, the exclusive economic zones. And on the y-axis, we have IUCN red list status or extinction risk. The key thing to note is the graph goes upwards. Basically, wider ranging species are falling between the cracks. They have a higher risk of extinction. This is counter to one of the most fundamental paradigms in terrestrial conservation, which is that species with small geographic ranges are most at risk, and geographic range per se offers some protection such that wider ranging terrestrial species are safe. Beyond that, most of what we know about conservation comes from iconic terrestrial organisms, which some also suffer hunting, some also suffer trade. So let's look at how complex it is to conserve African elephant, which is a species or group of species we've been trying to save for half a century now. It turns out there's, depending on which taxonomist you talk to, 2 or 3 species, and they're found across 37 countries of Africa. And so one way of thinking of the scale of a conservation challenge is to take the number of species and multiply it by the number of legal jurisdictions in which they're found. So we have a conservation complexity for African elephants of somewhere between 74 and 111. And we can undertake the same activity for white rhinoceros, black rhinoceros, grey parrot, the world's pangolins, and the African elephant. So we can kind of see where they sit on the global scale of conservation complexity. And these are species that many of us have tried to conserve for decades now. We can layer on top the number of EEZs spanned and the number of species of chondrichthyans. We can see on the left-hand side, there's over 200 species that are found in one country, a very typical problem that terrestrial conservation biologists will be familiar with. But as we move towards the right, we can see that the colors shift from green to yellow to red, showing the pattern I presented earlier, which is that species with wider geographic ranges are more likely to be threatened. On average, the average chondrichthyan species spans 8 exclusive economic zones, but we can see that there are a significant number of species that span more than 20 EEZs, and indeed the blue shark spans 146 exclusive economic zones and lives in the high seas. So what does this mean for conservation planning? Well, it means that it doesn't make much sense to start at the site or country level. Now, if we had lots of money, we could do that. But the reality is, if we're trying to save a species that spans 10, 20, 30 countries, we have to start and get the biggest bang per buck and start in the place or the country or the region where we're likely to get the biggest bang per buck. So we have to start by doing effectively a situational analysis at the global scale, and then downscale to region and then country. Now, this has the benefit that creating this global overview creates a huge motivation and in fact synchronizes donors to support the scientific community in pivoting towards these species. These species have previously not been considered to be iconic and charismatic compared to manta rays and white sharks and tiger sharks and so on. But their incredible threat has meant that a huge part of the scientific and conservation community has pivoted towards saving these new iconic species. What could be more iconic than a sit and wait predator with such amazing patterns that a diver can readily see in places like the Canary Islands? So we started and cut our teeth on focusing on the 5 species of sawfish in June 2012 at the Zoological Society of London. We developed a global strategy for their conservation with a vision, goals, and actions. We dubbed them the Ghosts of the Coasts, and this motivated donors to pour at a minimum $600,000 and possibly up to $1 million to enable scientists to search for the last remaining sawfishes. So 5 years on, we were able to gather together this massive amount of data from all of these newly created sawfish scientists. And we worked at Georgia Aquarium to undertake and downscale from a global plan to a regional plan and set priorities. And so what we learned really is that there are really only 2 places in the world, Florida, the USA, and Northern Australia, where sawfishes are safe and suitably conserved. And we've dubbed these places 2 lifeboats for sawfishes. But we also now have the evidence to split up our priorities into 4 regions: Caribbean, Amazon, Western Indian Ocean, and Australasia. We applied this template again to global devil and ray manta ray conservation, developing a conservation strategy in South Africa in June 2014. And again, we engendered a lot of sympathy for the devil rays, pivoting a large chunk of the community towards improving their conservation status. Now in Europe, we have 3 species of angel shark, and when we last undertook a red list assessment, we thought that the one at the bottom there, Squatina squatina, was largely eliminated throughout much of its range in the Mediterranean and Northeast Atlantic, and only a significant population was found in the Canary Islands. And so this led to a dual approach to develop a local Canary Island conservation strategy, but also to start the process of figuring out what is the status of the other angel sharks throughout European waters and indeed into North Africa and the Mediterranean. So here we have a situation where there are 22 angel sharks found in the cooler waters of South America, Taiwan, and the southwestern Indian Ocean, and the 3 species in the Eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean. The Angel Shark Project and colleagues are doing fantastic work at the local scale in the Canary Islands, really doing good work to protect the last stronghold of Squatina squatina. And we have a thrust also involving the Angel Shark Project, led by the Shark Trust, working in the Northeast Atlantic and now moving into sub-regional planning in the Mediterranean Sea, and putting feelers out to West Africa to figure out what's happening with angel sharks in this part of their distribution. So now we're in a position where we're downscaling to the regional and potentially even sub-regional scale. We have a vision where Mediterranean angel sharks are restored to robust populations, fulfilling their ecological roles in healthy ecosystems. And through these processes, we're building community, raising an incredible amount of understanding among donors that there are possibly more conservation targets to focus on. And the scientific community is being mobilized to report sightings of and go and search for angel sharks, again offering more conservation opportunity. So without further ado, I'm going to close here and thank you all for your interest in International Angel Shark Day. Goodbye.